We might make a start on this paper session about accessibility. There's only 3 papers in this session. I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker remotely, Mat Dalgleish. He'll be talking about, you might pronounce it differently to me, the Chimera, prototyping a new DMI for congenital one-handed musicianship through the autoethnographic lens. Look forward to it.
Okay, hello everyone. It's good to be with you in spirit, if not in person. This talk is about prototyping a new DMI for my own use case, which is that of a congenitally one-handed musician. Just to give you a bit of background, I'm based at Staffordshire University in the UK. I'm also a trustee of the OMI Trust, a UK-based music access charity, and I'm a long-time designer of new instruments with and for other people. I've learned to play trumpet, guitar, and modular synthesizer over the years, but I'm only a very recent DMI designer player. Whenever I mention the term disability, I'm referring to the social model of disability, whereby people are disabled by their environment, and we can regard all people as musicians or potential musicians with a spectrum of different abilities. I'll start with the idea that there's a kind of representation gap. If we think that we've had accessibility-focused DMIs dating back to the 1980s, and accessible DMIs have been regularly presented at NIME, we've also had a lot of the inside perspective of the instrument designer or the designer performer. And independently of these things, around 27% of adults in the EU have a disability, most commonly a physical disability. But to date, we've had very, very few accounts by physically disabled DMI designers or designer performers, with Andrew McMillan's standing out, who I think is the second talk in this session, which is a nice coincidence. So we have this kind of representation gap. We can identify a variety of issues which perhaps contribute to this. Say, as Garen and McPherson notes that disabled people have only rarely been meaningfully involved in designing accessible DMIs, and they suggest that part of the problem is perhaps the term co-design being used very, very loosely, or perhaps misused. We also have skews and knots suggesting that there's far more in the DMI area that could be adapted and made truly accessible, but makers lack the sector knowledge and skills. We might think that these two things are perhaps related. We've also got issues around designers, almost all of whom are non-disabled, making assumptions around what disabled players want, that they should try to develop normal instrumental techniques. I use normal there in quotes. And that the interfaces of accessible DMIs should mimic the familiar design language of traditional instruments, even if those instruments are exclusionary for the players that we're targeting. We've also got some issues around learning to play DMIs, but with disabled players potentially competing on non-disabled terms, which can be very off-putting. So these things all perhaps contribute to this representation gap in the field that we can identify. And in terms of why this matters, if it leads generally to DMIs being seen as inferior to traditional instruments, for a lot of non-disabled players, to play a DMI is a choice. They could play something else. But for some disabled players, the DMI is the only option. These DMIs perhaps do not tell the stories of their players. The disabled player perhaps doesn't relate to an instrument which doesn't completely understand them. And that restricts the development of attachment and intimacy which Pedro Robilo has discussed in terms of being vital for long-term engagement that we usually seek. Taken to its extreme, all these things together and bring the risk of what Fricker calls hermeneutical injustice, where an individual or a group's social experience becomes obscured from the collective understanding. Okay, in terms of my own background, perhaps most significantly, my disability is congenital, so I was born without a left hand or forearm. I also have several mobility-related issues as well, but primarily this means that I don't have a before and after. I've never known anything other than playing instruments one-handed, and that's maybe quite an important point. And after, in my very earliest years, lots of surgery, the kind of medical model dictating things. I had a period from age 3 or so to aged about 30, where my various impairments had become stable. And I learned to play the trumpet first of all, then the guitar a little bit later. And it's always taken me how very different the audience reactions are to me playing these instruments. The reason that I've started to develop a DMI for my own use now is that some of the more degenerative aspects of my orthopedic conditions have started to come into play over the last 10 years or so. Okay, so I think this idea that instruments have a kind of social life, kind of social baggage, has been really something that I've looked back on again and again. I played the trumpet in public most weeks for years, but as soon as I started playing guitar in public, people took issue with it. Not so much my musical abilities or any lack of, but a kind of certainty that this wasn't the instrument for me. I should be playing something else. The guitar was for other people. So this feeds in to my expanded DMI model that I've been kind of working around. So it's considering the DMI on a technological level as a holistic interface, mapping and sound generation, but also trying to consider the other less tangible layers that feed in beyond the technological, particularly the social, but also the musicological. In terms of the social, the ideas of Bates, that instruments can be not just actors in a network, but active protagonists. But only some instruments can be these protagonists, has been quite influential on me. As has the idea of Marinos Koutsimachlis, that instruments can tell stories of a sort. My design goals in producing a new DMI have really been around creating something which doesn't mimic the language of traditional instruments, to try and get away from the social baggage of a traditional instrument. Because I didn't know what the optimal design would be, to try and retain flexibility and the ability to change the design until relatively late in the development process, and to improve understanding of interaction techniques and mappings around fully one-handed use. At the same time, remembering that my disability is quite changeable and is likely to deteriorate slightly over time, and building in some spare bandwidth with the hope it might be something I can still play in a year's time or 5 years' time. So my approach to development is really based around using Eurorack synthesizer modules as a kind of flexible, reusable prototyping toolkit. Using that prototyping to try and discover the distinctive possibilities of one-handed musicianship through open-ended exploration, moving on, changing things, rejecting and going back to earlier designs in some instances, when the possibilities of a particular iteration appear exhausted, very well known, or just plain unsatisfactory. So Buxton makes a clear distinction between sketching and prototyping. Much more influential on my approach is Musicianship's notion of sketching in hardware, which tries to combine some of the desirable properties of sketching, its speed and its fluidity, with a hardware prototyping process that lets functionality be tested very early on. So Eurorack is essentially my prototyping toolkit here. The Eurorack format was developed by Dopfer in the 90s, first presented as part of the Dopfer A100 system, but by the early 2000s, many more makers had joined the format, and modules from different makers can be mixed and endlessly rearranged. Crucially for me, in terms of being able to carry something around, the Eurorack format is smaller than many traditional modular synthesizer formats. If this idea of prototyping this way requires a significant initial investment in a large modular system, this is something I had already that I built up over about 15 years. So it became a library of modules that can be borrowed. Similar systems are perhaps increasingly available in institutions and so on. And so borrowing from this main system to quickly create functional prototypes. I developed 11 iterations in total over a period of 100 days, about 3 months. And I started with 3 reference points. Perhaps most important is the use of a joystick for input. This was something that I tried and tested previously. It was a known good fit for my hand. And then I tried to avoid mimicking the sound or signal flow or control possibilities of acoustic instruments. You can see here the idea of taking modules from the bigger system and then building the prototype in the foreground. And really, for me, the process was starting with too much and whittling away at what was there until I left only the essence of what I needed, or trying to get to that. So the first iteration is more complex than the final iteration. Perhaps the other thing to note is that the dotted lines are optional signal paths. They can be activated by router. And you can see some of the notes that I kept alongside. And I kept logs of kind of the experience, what worked well, what didn't, and recordings of the output of these things. So in all, I spent something like 80 hours over 3 months prototyping and playing these things. Through this exploratory period, the prototypes I developed, the iterations I developed, had a strong sense of directly manipulating sound, but as if it were a 3D material rather than on the note-by-note level. And in terms of this sculpting, the importance of timely feedback became clear. The prototypes had only audio and visual feedback, and this could sometimes get lost in the busy sensory environment as the system was kind of producing its output. Crucially for me, it was the first time that I played something which was fully single-handed, rather than, say, playing a trumpet one-handed, which is usually involved, or a guitar one-handed, which is usually involved using the other arm to a certain extent. And it dramatically reduced the chronic back pain that I've been experiencing. So I could play more, I could play for longer, and that was perhaps the most substantial difference for me. It became enjoyable to play again. The second stage of prototyping was to take the final iteration of stage 1 and to turn it into this little standalone instrument based on the Favilla platform, taking the synthesizer patch and then recreating it in pure data, running that off on the Favilla board, still with the joystick as input, with the addition of this little touchpad just for navigating through some settings. So that's kind of where it's at this stage. a portable, standalone, self-contained physical prototype. In terms of things that I've found out through this process, URAC does seem sufficiently flexible to support exploration of ideas, but also to adapt to changing physicality. It became clear over the 3-month period that my body and its abilities, perhaps like all bodies eventually, is in flux. There are good days and bad days, but also things are just changing over time. And this perhaps means that trying to chase the perfect setup, or particularly the perfect interface, is perhaps fool's gold. There's no interface that remains ideal forever. It's therefore useful if we can adjust and alter and change things at no or low cost. Many of the more interesting and satisfying musical possibilities emerged from thinking about what the hand can do, rather than trying to translate two-handed techniques into or two-handed instrument outputs into the one-handed case. And so thinking through a kind of physical repertoire of gesture, however limited that might be, and trying to make the most of that was far more satisfying than sort of bad imitations of two-handed play. But it begged the question of what to play. And is it good? Haven't been playing the instrument for very long. The confidence problem, I don't really have anything to compare it to. It's quite unlike the things that I've played before. I found generally that improvisation, solo improvisation, was enjoyable for me, but I wonder if it would be for audiences. It's something perhaps to find out. And it perhaps brings us back to the age-old repertoire problem for DMIs. Whether we get repertoire to support the instruments that are being developed. Okay, so to wrap up with some directions for future work, in the short term, I've actually started working on it, producing an album which uses the prototype either entirely or heavily to try and give more of a focus to the open-ended explorations I've been doing so far, try and make something more sort of focused and listenable. Producing multiple units, it should be relatively simple to reproduce what I've got. There's lots of open source parts there to enable some testing with other one-handed players, potentially longitudinal testing, which takes in whether players are staying engaged over time, would be particularly interesting for me. And then in the longer term, integrating haptic feedback into the instrument body to try and address some of its limitations that it has currently, to give more kind of precise timing to the feedback that the player's getting. And then more conceptually, I'm really interested in how disability intersects with the DMI reception issues that we know about. And there's a notion of narrative prosthesis developed by Mitchell and Snyder that I think initially might help to explain some of the reception issues that we experience. More ambitiously, perhaps, I'm interested in how DMIs can be more fully or richly integrated into the National Plan for Music Education in the UK, with the idea of building understanding and engagement with DMIs for all players and players of all abilities from the ground up, starting earlier, starting younger, and perhaps avoiding some of the issues that we've seen now while increasing participation and representation. And with that, I think we're at time. And so if you've got any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Great, round of applause for Matt. Time for a couple of questions. I'm sure there's many in the room. Anyone? Yeah?
Hello, Matt. Thank you for that. One question that I had in relation to the scalability of time, one of the things that you mentioned was I see it as potentially a calibration challenge in the tools that you're using. So like, for example, the joystick from a day-to-day basis, the ability for you to be able to use the joystick. In my practice, I work with dancers and sonifying the movement of dancers. And so from one dancer to the next, their ability to be able to move is definitely different. And so it's through software, it's through calibration that I'm able to really adapt that before the actual performance, so that the same setup of whether it's, what the Euro or act looks like can work with that individual. So I guess my question to you is whether or not you factored in calibration into the process yet.
Yeah, so there's a bit of echo at this end, but I think I've got your question. Around calibration, part of the work that I've done previously, and part of the sort of known good of the joystick comes from it being at this point quite carefully calibrated to the range of my hand, so that it's capable of doing subtle movement, but also kind of larger gestures without kind of straining, without on a bad day when there's kind of more limited movement, surpassing what it's capable of. You mentioned scalability. This is where it got quite echoey, but you mentioned scalability as well. But I think there's a possibility of swapping out the joystick, for instance, as an input device, replacing it with camera tracking, keeping some of the same kind of gestures in there, but using a camera as a kind of highly scalable input device to track those gestures. You'd lose some of the physicality, but it would perhaps enable dancers and so on, or people with gross motor control, but not so much fine motor control, to control similar processes.
Yeah, and so I'm thinking about like Leap, potentially Leap controller and/or an IMU like from MoveSense that could be worn on the wrist and then calibrated like within PD itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the nice things about the prototype being modular is it makes it possible to try out lots of different things, to swap modules in and out, to try things without having to change the whole system, adjusting the mappings. I was using the Expert Sleepers device with pure data to enable me to explore and change mappings and scalings and things as I went, both physical mappings and in software.
Thank you.
Great, we might need to leave it there. Matt, thank you very much. I highly recommend reading this paper and getting in touch with Matt and keeping connecting. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
One more round of applause. Next up, all the way from New Zealand, we have, sorry, I got the wrong one up. We have the Sliderphone, a tactile accessible musical instrument. This is by Andrew McMillan and Fabio Morreale.
Kia ora. Hi everyone. Thanks, Matt. That was wonderful. I'm actually going to put a counterpoint across because I'm actually trying to emulate playing conventional instruments with this instrument. As I said, I'm Andrew McMillan. I'm speaking on behalf of Fabio Morreale and myself about the development of the Sliderphone. This is an accessible musical instrument developed out of need, reflection, and my free improvisation as my creative practice. The Sliderphone is not just an instrument, but it's also the response to a problem of how can someone play expressively when traditional instruments become inaccessible. So before 2004, I'd been a saxophonist and improviser, but after an accident left me paralyzed, I had to rethink how I made music. So I was exploring how I could use conventional instruments and DMI to create accessible musical instruments. I found there was a dissatisfaction with the playability of these. And although I could make and sculpt sound, I didn't feel like I was playing them. I felt like they were playing me. So I wanted to create a new design, developed from that experience, but with a more considered design approach that could help me understand and better create a better connection and agency with the instrument. So we looked at reframing the problem, asking what movements do I have for a start, and as a musician, what did I need from an instrument? So it's kind of led us to a unique blend of design based on occupational therapy and using archival recordings and autoethnographic reflection. So I'd used occupational therapy methods to map my functional range in a previous work published. And during that time, I'd rediscovered recordings from pre-disability improvisations. And so I was able to analyze these. I was able to analyze my technique, reflected particularly on the feel, tactility, and the response of the instruments I was playing, and how the creative flow from those sessions compared to my post-disability AMI work. So this gave us a map of what I needed an instrument to do based on embodied music memory. The methodology also required me to have an assistant to help with the construction and setup, and this became participatory and collaborative from that perspective. So the results of the reflections provided better understanding of the kind of interactions I was looking for. For a start, accessing the instrument physically in its setup and being able to play like the entire range of its possibilities was important. Having responsiveness and tactility and being able to feel how the instrument was performing with me and how I could control it. Obviously, how I can control the pitch dynamics, any register changes and timbre changes. And there was also a quality that I felt important, to have fluidity and spontaneity, especially in free improvisation. And through controlling in the interactions, I wanted to be able to create, explore, and develop material spontaneously. And these became sort of like design targets, really. So the first prototype was a cardboard tube prototype. We put an ultrasonic sensor in it. The idea of using a slide was inspired by post-disability experiences with a slide whistle, and this became a usable and useful test bed. Once this was tested and deemed successful, we discarded it to use more rigid materials. So the next iteration was built from standard-sized PVC plumbing pipes and a plastic project box housing an Arduino Uno and ultrasonic sensor. As we designed it, other sensors and interfaces were added to provide more playability over a number of sessions. Put a pressure sensor in for breath control of articulation and dynamics, a ribbon membrane potentiometer to change the register, and a master volume fader for the overall output of the instrument. To attach it to the wheelchair, we created a mount using a camera bracket. This was pretty versatile but unstable due to the single fixture point you can see in the photo, hopefully. Once it was attached to the chair, the other problem was if I wanted to be freed from the instrument and come back and play it later, it required totally removing from the chair, reattaching, and usually repositioning on my return. But thanks to the advice from Rachel Wolfson, of course Matt will know Rachel, from OMI, we eventually moved to drum hardware, which has made the instrument stable, freestanding, and easier to position or step away from. And I'll show a slide of that soon. So I'm going to play a little video. Hopefully you can hear it. And if not, just let me know, because I'll just, move on to the next slide. This shows the setup without the drum hardware and me playing a melody of Night and Day, Cole Porter's. So... right, I won't put you through any more of that. But look at took me right back to my jazz school days, playing with a band in a box. It wasn't complex, but it was the first time I'd really played a melody like in time since before my accident. I also felt that I was able to react and express myself, you know, although as a beginner, through the musical phrases. So moving on, in recent months, this is what I was talking about with the hardware, we've developed from the original prototype and addressed that stability. Also looked at the register sensor that had some issues and the accessibility. You can see the drum hardware there, how it supports it and stabilizes it. We also reconstructed the entire body and the base of the instrument from aluminium, but still using standard off-the-shelf products because that's been important throughout the whole thing. The final alteration was to replace that membrane potentiometer with this hinged pedal system that I designed. It presses on buttons to activate the register changes, which have a larger surface area. They're more easy to activate accurately. And they've also got a tactility that even with my sensory impairments, I can feel under my thumb, and that was lacking in the soft membrane potentiometer. So the takeaway points of what I learned, I guess, were that interweaving personal reflection with analytical and design methodologies became a valuable tool for creating the framework. Really excited about the potential here for sharing this design, the process of making it, and the instrument itself as an open source DIY. I'm able to play again, I guess, improvise and reconnect with a part of my creative identity that I'd really felt was missing before this. And the slider phones brought me back to this aspect of performing where I can look forward again to collaborating with other, you know, conventional instrumentalists and hopefully a lot of other AMI users to pursue opportunities for co-creating and performing. So it's pretty much the whole thing, but I just want to thank Fabio Morreale, Rachel Wolfson, and my assistant for the work they did. And if there's a few seconds left, I'll just play the latest recording with the aluminium version, which shows this. Hopefully I've progressed. Okay. So there we go. That's that. That's the slider phone as it is. We can take it.
For Andrew. Thank you very much, Andrew. Any questions in the audience? Sure there are. No? I'll do a quick one while people think through. Thanks for that. Your paper was wonderful too. What really struck me was, and you didn't mention it in here, and I maybe elaborate a bit more, was on the process of listening to recordings of you playing the saxophone early in life and reflecting on that. Is there more that you can say to that in this presentation?
Yeah, I guess there's two aspects to that too. It's not just my recordings. There's like every time I go out and watch a saxophonist now, you know, there's always a little bit of me that kind of gets hurt. And that's been something to deal with. And I guess there's a real what do you call it? I guess there's a real ableism about this, and that's the difference between Matt and I in that way, is that I've got this before and after, and he talked about not having that, and so I have to kind of deal with that. It's 20 years since my accident, so it's not so bad now, but at first it was quite hurtful. But the reflective process gave me some really good, both quite strict technical analytical data about, and it's quite basic what I presented here, but my notes are a bit more detailed, that you can really drill down into technique aspects, but also about how it makes you feel about what your relationship with the instruments was. And it's that musician-instrument relationship and that kind of embodied relationship with the instrument that I was trying to rekindle and reconnect with. And although in this version I've used playing melodic content, Western scale melodic content and strict jazz kind of repertoire, the idea is that it then can become expressive in other ways. But I guess there were two things to that reflective process: the technical analysis and sort of the more emotive and phenomenological kind of aspect of it. Does that sort of give an idea?
Oh, completely, yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe one more quick question if anyone's got one, or... Oh, yes, I've got one.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear, thanks.
I was very touched by your presentation. I thought it was great. I was curious if there was a core methodology for designing for accessibility that you maybe had as a takeaway from this whole process.
Oh, that's a really good
music.
Yeah, great question. I think the thing is, and actually, Seth's presentation, when he was dealing with autism yesterday, that I was lucky enough to catch a good amount of, talked about how you can't assume anything. And I guess assumption is probably the biggest thing, and including for myself. Measuring was important for us. It gave us a really, using the OT methods and developing our own occupational therapy methods was important, because when we went to design, we knew kind of intimately what was going to work and what wasn't going to work. And so then it became about the experiential elements and finding ways to interlink them. Of course, all of this interweaves into what design processes you've got available. And if you're doing participatory and collaborative design, you've got to, I think, have it led by the subject, which everybody absolutely intends to do, I'm sure. But it's a tricky balance, in this situation, about how you manage that relationship and how you look best to provoke, and I guess provoke the ideas from the person you're making the instrument with. It's tricky, and I'm still writing about it at the moment, and it's a main part of my thesis, or main part of these few chapters of my thesis is looking at that very question. So I haven't really solved it yet. Sorry, I can't tell you. But if you read the paper, maybe that could give some ideas, and the OT one might give you some ideas as well. That was the one that we published last year.
Yeah, great work, Andrew. Thank you for those contributions. And a round of applause, Andrew. And last today, we have Steph OHara, who will present his paper, The Sound Tree Project, Developing Personal and Collective Expression with Accessible Digital Musical Instruments.
Thank you. I'd first like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking, the Ngunnawal people, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Hi, my name is Steph OHara, and I'm an interactive artist currently doing practice-based research at Sensi Lab, Monash University in Melbourne. I like to create immersive experiences with and for communities, be it in an immersive theatre context, musical performances or installations. And now I'm currently using my time as a researcher to try to articulate my experiences, my tacit knowledge, my creative intuitions, and ideas around designing inclusive interactions. And today I'd like to share my experience developing the work The Sound Tree and how I use code as a creative material to build accessible digital musical instruments, and how I can support both personal and collective musical expression. This project was a sustained 6-month ethnographic engagement with 5 performers and 2 support artists and myself, and we explored how to create interactions for ourselves and together for a public performance outcome. The work centred around an accessible sound sculpture the group had previously developed, and we incorporated a number of wireless motion sensors to wear or embed in materials, creating a number of digital and hybrid instruments, combining acoustic and digital instruments. Some of the challenges that we identified at the beginning of the project was around current accessible instrument design, typically focused on either a solo or group interaction, and rarely addressed both of these simultaneously. The second challenge was relying on a short-term engagement, and that often limits the understanding of how instruments might evolve through extended practice. And thirdly, how to create and use technology as an adaptive design process into the workshop rehearsal space that supported modification and ongoing development of the instruments we were wanting to make. And so my approach going into this project was to build and then use an adaptive live coding system that explored wearable and physical integration of our gestural instruments over a sustained creative development process. The technology we were using as a framework was built around the gestural interface, the air sticks, which was an IMU sensor that was developed at SensiLab. I used a Raspberry Pi 5 served as a central hub, and each hub processed up to 4 air sticks simultaneously, transforming data between performers' gestures and sound generation. The system used Super Collider and supported a live coding environment where synthesis, mappings, logic, and patterns could be encapsulated into a single source code file. These files could be reloaded at any time, offering the flexibility of creative coding and shaping our instruments. The work itself was in 3 phases. We met fortnightly at the beginning, and the first phase, we got together and started collecting ideas, movement vocabularies through drawing, listening, moving, sound creation. We also recorded our voices and playing traditional musical instruments. And this phase was also really important in building trust with each other, building trust with ourselves, and also our creative practice. The second phase, we introduced the air sticks and the technology, and we started experimenting wearing the air sticks, placing the air sticks in objects, crafting, and doing lots of group improvisations. And at this point, we also used code as material. So sometimes I was playing the air sticks and sometimes I was coding, and we were designing and discussing sound and gesture. A useful tool I had already previously developed is called OSCAM, and I use this quite a bit. And this is a simple app that captures both video and motion data of performance gestures, and this allows us to replay a gesture performance or an interaction and also have the data captured as well, so we can refine or evaluate the performance. The last phase brought all the technology together to support the show, developing a narrative for the performance, so we had an arc of the show, and that turned into weekly performances. And in those weekly rehearsals. And for each rehearsal, we were refining the instruments, working together towards the final public performance that included solos, duets, trios, and full ensemble pieces. At this point, I'd also like to acknowledge that I don't have permission to play a video for this work, so I just have pictures. I now want to share a couple of what I call magic moments that occurred during the development and the performance. of this work. The first magic moment is one performer enjoyed high energy repeating interaction possibilities. And we developed an instrument that responded to bold, expansive movements with equally dynamic sonic results. The mapping design featured multiple parameters controlling timbre and rhythms, with a slowly evolving chord progression based on the energy performed over time. This performer's engagement was characterised by exploration of maximum intensity and range of movement, visible excitement and laughter during discovery and rediscovery, continuous pushing of the instrument's dynamic limits. And this is a lovely example of live coding and making the instrument more complicated. I continue to work with this group, and in particular this performer. We have this sort of dialogue every time we work together where I push and he pushes the dynamics of this instrument to see exactly how far we can take it. Another magic moment is a performer developed an instrument that magnified very subtle gestures that was focused on wrist movements. We used embedding the ADMI inside some blue fabric, and that was also to use to amplify the gesture physically and also suggested a sound narrative. So this instrument we decided to call the Wind, and this controlled a synthetic wind synthesizer that was played throughout the performance. The resulting instrument demonstrated how the system could adapt to support highly controlled, intimate forms of expression. And this instrument itself was used in several modes, so the Wind appeared in the show several times with several slightly different mappings. The third magic moment is an innovative approach emerged through two performers' integration of live voice, recorded samples of movement. The duo created a dynamic performance piece using recorded personalised vocalisations of a chicken and a frog that was integrated as sound samples. Physical embodiment of the animals, with being a chicken and a frog during the performance and provided movement inspiration. And additionally, live vocalisations in response to the ADMI samples were part of the performance. This turned into a really exciting comical piece that then was joined by the entire ensemble that went joined up with everyone playing an animal sound, a vocalised animal sound. This moment illustrated for me using personal sound materials and movement could be a great source of inspiration for creative performance narratives. Some of the key insights I got from this project. Firstly, the live coding practice enabled immediate response to our needs and allowed different modes of communication and evaluation. This also placed the majority of the making inside the doing experience. And this also gave agency in designing and implementing and interfacing with the air sticks. The second insight was around the sustained engagement impact. This idea of trust and connecting with each other, connecting with the technology and trusting the technology, having a deep relationship developed between performers and their instruments. And also with this extended time, it allowed us to develop complex mapping strategies to emerge. Thirdly, having a personal collective expression. Having a choice of wearing or embedding an air stick inside materials inspired narrative creation. We also used the air sticks. Air sticks sort of evolved into a multiple networked group of devices in which the devices themselves could act as individual instruments, or all of the devices could act as a meta instrument. Some examples were creating environmental soundscapes, where some of the air sticks were wind, rain, one air stick was thunder. Another example was a percussionist wearing an air stick to play a bass line while playing the djembe, meanwhile a red ball is playing a melody. And all of these were also networked and understood what each other were doing, so we could make cohesive music together. Future directions of this project, we're developing the air kit into something that can be taken home and used in creative practice. We're 3D printing and putting the entire module into a case and supplying many of the artists we're working with to be able to develop And we're co-designing and co-developing this entire process. So there's a new UI, there's a new visualization system that we're working together with all the artists to develop. And the AirSticks now has the capacity to add extra additional sensors. So we're playing with flex sensors and buttons. Thank you.
Thank you, Steph. Any questions?
I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you. It was a very nice work. Thanks. I just wanted to ask you the process, how you actually, like, I'm just curious, how would you choose a particular modality or the kind of sensing technology that you would, before even getting into that? Let's say you want to track the body. There are different ways, either computer vision based, yeah, and a tracker based, wearable based. But yeah, we know that optics has certain things like visual occlusion. So this wearables can actually go through that. But would you even think these things before even you know that you want to track and then you want to do something with music production? How would you actually? What's your thought process behind choosing a particular tracking technology to build up for this entire interaction?
Yes, so I've done depth camera tracking and all sorts of different types of interactive. I like to approach sensors not as something you choose and hope to get something out of, but just as a design material that I don't actually understand how it works. And so I don't have an idea of, I want to do this, I'm going to try and find the best sensor, or I just grab a sensor that I think might look interesting, build something around it so that I can play with it, and then try to understand how it works. Yeah, so I'm very much into the sort of practice research of doing rather than thinking. And also, I find that that's a really great way, especially when you're collaborating with people. There's a lot of embedded knowledge in your body and the way you interact with something that you might not be able to consider or assume how someone might interact with something. So I find it's a much, for me anyway, a much greater kind of creative process of not really having a plan other than having the technology to support that exploration, and then try and discover what that sensor or that way of capturing, say, motion, and then from there see what you can do. Yeah. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was great. You mentioned briefly in the presentation and a little bit more in the paper the idea of narratives, so like sound narratives, object narratives, and how the stories participants either created about the object or maybe were given about the object changed their performances and how they chose to use it. Can you talk a bit more about that process of coming up with the narratives and then documenting them afterwards?
Sure. So this is for me. This is a really. I find this goes even further back to creating with community, and this idea of like giving agency to everyone in the room. If you're collaborating with people, that they participate. And so one of the many conversations we had at each of our workshops that were like the casual conversations of just how are you. A lot of things around environment were brought up. And so I just pulled at those little environments and started discussing about, favourite animals, what kind of pets do we have, how are your pets? And so this gave an in-way into like connecting with someone, but also started a narrative. And then this narrative is then owned by the group. And from that, we then started playing with, we brought all those sounds. I just had sample libraries and we just started listening to these sounds. And then we took those sounds and turned them into samples. We also vocalized those animals. And then we put them into the sampling units and then we started to play those samples. And so in a way, everyone had agency around the entire process of building the instrument, including the sound content. This also then gave us, I guess, narrative material type subjects. So the animals then had what we like to call personalities, and so there was behaviour, and this idea of sound having a behaviour or the interaction. So we had a very, excited animal, and these animals didn't sound like the animals. We actually processed them. So the animals didn't represent, we weren't playing, there was the chicken and the frog, but there are other animals that were like, a really hyper kind of excited creature that bounced around on a string. And then there was another one that was sort of a slower growl. And there was also a laughter that we used. One of the performers had this great laugh. And they were also really connected to the kookaburra. So that became the kookaburra. And then we had the sound tree. And it's sort of all, like in that creative process where things start to appear through the process and you start to sort of collect. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for this session, for your speakers and continued conversation.